We are here tonight to pay our tribute to a moral hero. Julian Assange is being charged for publications that are amongst the most important truthful revelations of criminal state behavior that have been made public in United States history. Those are the words of Daniel Ellsberg in relation to Julian Assange. The whistleblower's whistleblower includes Julian Assange in his own circle of moral heroes. We now have music and poetry by Agnete Haaland and Tord Trygve.
To passasjerer på samme fly. To velfridde herrer fra Vesten. De fødtes kan hende i samme by, og døptes av samme presten. To passasjerer på samme fly, med overvektig bagasje. Den ene kremmer i krutt og bly. Den andre i bønn og bandasje. Snart møter de sammen i samme hus med tilbud til statsoverhoder. Den ene kan bombe en landsby i grus. Den andre kan tørke vekk blodet. Den ene har high-tech og suveren, og giftgass som river i nesen. Og leketøysminer som splintrer et ben. Den andre kan tilby protesen. Den ene kan svi av åker og eng, forgifte alt jord som lå øde. Det andre kan slå opp en telt og en seng til godtfolk som nesten døde. Og hver har sin plikt, og hver har sin dumt, og ingen har tenkt å svikte. For begge kan se mot en rød horisont. Her ingen fred i sikte. De skilles fra kunden med klink og med bukk. Hver tenker, jeg gjorde mitt beste. Og dupper på jumboen hjem med et sukk. Å Gud, hva blir så det neste? Og det neste diktet skrevet av teologen Martin Niemöller. Han satt selv i nazistenes konsentrasjonsleire fra 1937 til 1945. Først tok de kommunistene, men jeg brydde meg ikke, for jeg ikke kommunist. Så tok de sosialdemokratene, men jeg brydde meg ikke, for jeg ikke sosialdemokrat. Så tok de fagforeningslederne. Jeg brydde meg ikke. Jeg ikke fagforeningsleder. Så tok de jødene. Men jeg brydde meg ikke. Jeg er ikke jøde. Til slutt tok de meg. Men da var det ingen igjen til å bry seg.
You heard Arne Ruth, the Swedish media man, and of course Agnete Haaland, you know, and Tord Gustavsen with Trygve Seim. We're going to go back to Arne now. We have a greeting from Germany, from Günter Wallraff. It's in German, of course, and Arne is going to introduce it in English for those of us who would love to think we understand German.
Through Wikileaks, Julian Assange has uncovered the worst of war crimes committed by the United States. Because of this, his life is put at risk. Moreover, his reputation is destroyed. This is character assassination in the literal sense. His case matches a manual for the doings of security services. The legal process based on unfounded accusations was cancelled long ago. Nonetheless, his public image is marred by unceasing manipulations. Rumors and slander is widely spread by security services, turning him into a non-person, a self-serving demon, the physical presentation of a monster. For the last 10 years, he's been tortured by isolation in various forms, with the purpose of making him into a warning signal for all investigative journalists. Together with Alexei Navalny, he belongs to the most important political opponents of our age, with a death threat hanging over them. They are the core element, each in his specific political system, which shows how not only autocracies, but also democracies like the United States hit back when government crimes are exposed. I have a proposal. Politicians and human rights organizations should launch Assange and Navalny as joint candidates for the Nobel Peace Prize. This would be a strong and convincing signal. The universality of human rights should be applicable to both cases. This means that the Eastern as well as the Western entities should not be able to point an accusing finger at each other while staging themselves as upholders of rights and freedoms. If Julian Assange is delivered to the United States with 175 years of imprisonment waiting for him, it would in reality mean a declaration of bankruptcy for the rule of law and the freedom of the press. It would destroy our trust in the reliability of democratic rights. At the heart of the matter lies the fate of a fellow journalist, a man who is delivered into destruction. His name is Julian Assange.
Julian Assange hat mit Wikileaks schwerste Kriegsverbrechen der USA aufgedeckt. Dafür trachtet man ihm nach dem Leben. Zusätzlich soll sein Ruf zerstört werden. Rufmord im wortwörtlichen Sinn. Sein Fall wie aus einem Lehrbuch der Geheimdienste entsprungen. Das Verfahren gegen ihn wegen eines vermeintlichen Fehlverhaltens ist längst eingestellt worden. Doch die öffentliche Meinung über ihn wurde und wird ins Negative manipuliert. Gerüchte und Verleumdungen werden über Geheimdienstkanäle gezielt gestreut. So wurde er zur Unperson, zum Aussätzigen, zum egozentrischen Dämon, ja zum Monster fabriziert. Julian Assange wird nun seit 10 Jahren durch Isolation und Einzelhaft psychischer Folter unterworfen. Damit soll ein Präzedenzfall und Abschreckungsszenario für den Aufdeckungsjournalismus insgesamt geschaffen werden. Zusammen mit Alexei Nawalny gehört er zu den wichtigsten mit dem Tode bedrohten politischen Oppositionellen überhaupt in dieser Zeit. Zentrale Pole in ihrem jeweiligen System, an denen sich zeigt, wie autokratische Regime, aber auch Demokratien wie die USA zurückschlagen, wenn Staatsverbrechen öffentlich gemacht werden. Mein Vorschlag, Politiker und Menschenrechtsorganisationen aufzufordern, Nawalny und Assange gemeinsam für den Friedensnobelpreis vorzuschlagen. Das wäre ein wichtiges, überzeugendes politisches Signal mit großer Wirkmächtigkeit. Denn Menschenrechte sind, und das sollten wir uns immer wieder vergegenwärtigen, unteilbar. So lieferte es dem westlichen wie dem östlichen Lager nicht mehr den Vorwand, der jeweils anderen Seite demokratisches Fehlverhalten vorzuwerfen und sich selbst als Hüter von Recht und Freiheit zu inszenieren. Zuletzt haben im Sommer 2021 120 Politiker und Personen des öffentlichen Lebens einen von mir initiierten Brief an die damalige Kanzlerin Angela Merkel unterzeichnet und darin aufgefordert, sich beim US-Präsidenten für Assange rechtsstaatliche Behandlung und Freilassung einzusetzen. Immerhin bekleiden heute einige der Unterzeichner Ministerämter. Ich habe sie jetzt in einem persönlichen Brief aufgefordert, ihrem Anspruch und ihrer Verantwortung gerecht zu werden und sich als Bundesregierung für Julian Assange einzusetzen. Sollte Julian Assange an die USA ausgeliefert und, das droht ihm, bis zu 175 Jahren Haft verurteilt werden, wäre das eine Bankrotterklärung für unsere immer wieder reklamierte Rechtsstaatlichkeit, Meinungs- und Pressefreiheit. Es geht hier um unser demokratisches Selbstverständnis, um unsere Glaubwürdigkeit. Aber vor allem, es geht hier um einen Kollegen, einen dem Tod auf Raten ausgelieferten Menschen. Es geht um Julian Assange.
We have another greeting from one of the defenders of Julian Assange internationally, Nils Melzer, the UN rapporteur on torture. Arne, we have to lean more on Arne than we had anticipated due to the COVID today. At least two people have been not coming. And Arne has been working hours with Nils Melzer the last year. And he's working on a broader production with him. So we asked Arne to extract 6 or 8 points from Nils Melzer's position at the moment, where he describes and he boils down to the essence of his views on Julian Assange and the case against Julian Assange. So Arne will, with the help of a PowerPoint presentation, he will introduce us to Nils Melzer's ideas.
This will be in several parts. I tried to keep them as short as possible, all in all, in 8 parts. The first one. The Assange case is extremely important, but it is only the tip of the iceberg. It's like a keyhole through which you can see the parallel universe that has been created by the powerful stakeholders in combination with the national security establishment of various states. They are really cooperating in a parallel universe behind the smokescreen of secrecy. What Wikileaks tries to do is really to replace the media in its fourth estate function, which they are no longer assuming. We also believe in the Western democracies that we have press freedom, that we have freedom of expression, and we are free to discuss anything you want. And so we see all those headlines in the newspapers, and we are free to have an opinion whether, for example, Assange is a good guy or a bad guy. But what we don't realize is that the only topic put on our menu is whether Julian Assange is a good guy or a bad guy. But the important thing of the story, that he's being persecuted because he has revealed crucial facts. Who's discussing that? Who is getting upset that we have thousands of perpetrators of war crimes, of torture and rape, who have never been held accountable? And then they return to their country, and they can become police officers. And then everybody is shocked when we see the murder of George Floyd, but we don't realize the connection that the authorities haven't prosecuted war criminals for decades. So it comes back to haunt our societies. If we continue to close our eyes, we will not escape from the consequences. Can we have a democracy if we don't know what's happening? If we are not allowed to know what our governments are doing with the power and the money we give to them? If you are only allowed to freely discuss those news that are being presented to us? And so, Wikileaks come in and says, okay, now we will inform you, and we will provide you just the naked facts, and you will interpret it yourself. And that is of societal crucial relevance. Wikileaks is a key new actor in the fourth estate, and that's why the power establishment are so scared. We now have a rogue actor coming along and actually fulfilling the traditional functions of the press. You have to balance press freedom against legitimate interests of national security or privacy. The press cannot do everything, but they can provide you with the truth about misconduct of governments. Now, clearly, if they provide false information, it might be criminal, it might be leading to civil liability. That's why I'm saying it's important that they are not outside the law. But to be honest, the problem has never been that Wikileaks is outside of the law. The problem is that governments are increasingly outside of the law, and they want to protect that privilege. Wikileaks just says, we want to be a press organization. We want to have the protection of press freedom. But as far as I know, they have never spread false news. They have gone to great lengths to try to prevent any harm. The evidential hearings in London actually shows that Wikileaks was more protective of the interests of the people that could be exposed than the mainstream media were that actually cooperated with them, publishing those files. When Julian Assange found out that the Guardian journalist was going to publish unredacted information, he actually contacted the White House. And there is an audio recording of his phone call with the White House, trying to inform them that this is coming, that it's out of his control, and that he was ready to cooperate with the US to try to do harm reduction, which I find quite impressive. None of the other mainstream publishers had offered that. Unfortunately, I feel that we are currently faced with a regression into a modern form of absolutism. The capitalist system creates a small oligarchy that controls all the means. It's combined with the large-scale privatization, traditional government functions, even such as security and intelligence are now controlled by very few private actors. We are creating an economic oligarchy that owns all the land and the means and the houses. Everybody else is just a consumer mass. Probably at some point, the balance will tip, as it always does. And unfortunately, the likelihood is big that this will not be entirely peaceful. That is the kind of process that I believe we are in. And that's quite scary to see, because we are running the whole system at the wall. Basically, it's like looking at the car crash in slow motion. I just want you to know the source of this is an interview I made with Nils Melzer in late November last year. Thank you.
You know, the hearings, the court case against Julian is a public event, so they need their generosity. The authorities allowed 2 seats every day up on the balcony to represent the public. Of course, our next speaker got up 4 in the morning, Deepa Driver, to be one of the 2 public not prosecutors, witnesses, yeah.
It is a privilege to be here today. I'm an academic and a trade unionist in my day job. So to be a legal observer in Julian's case has been incredibly eye-opening for me. I've attended most of the hearings through the process on behalf of the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers, and although my comments are in a personal capacity, I think it has really changed me and made me understand what's going on in the world around me, and I hope I'm able to share some of those learnings with you. Wikileaks, when it burst onto the scene, revolutionized a world where print journalism, the Murdochs and the Maxwells of this world, were constraining the range of acceptable debate, where technology had entered into the world and yet all the information was in print form and therefore limited in terms of its distribution and in terms of the kinds of people who had access to it. And if you think of what Daniel Ellsberg did with the Pentagon Papers, photocopying all the papers overnight with the help of his young son, Wikileaks allowed whistleblowers to provide vast volumes of evidence without having to expose themselves in the way Ellsberg did. And like the Pentagon Papers had this, to accompany them, you know, in the media, we have this image from the Vietnam War of a child running, naked, burning. The iconic image of the Iraq War is the collateral murder video that WikiLeaks released. And it is this image that is seared into our memory that reminds us that what was being done in Iraq and Afghanistan wasn't a righteous war to free women or to help the Iraqis get free from Saddam. It was Britain and America and their allies destroying another civilization. And it was also evidence that WikiLeaks provided of children like Hanan Saleh Mathrour, an 8-year-old child who was killed in the street by soldiers whom she used to pick up little sweets from, or gave names and identities through the detainee assessment briefs of the 789 Muslim men who suffered at Guantanamo in the most horrendous ways. It also gave us information through Cablegate and elsewhere of Khaled El-Masri and the shame of Europe, where a German citizen was picked up on the Macedonian border, tortured, stripped naked, beaten, sodomized, rendited, and even when they found it was a case of mistaken identity. They continued to torture him further because he must be a bad guy, while they argued between themselves as to who would take responsibility. They then dumped him on the Albanian border. He was picked up by the Albanian police and sent back to Germany, where nobody believed his story, this man who had suffered so much. And it was only through WikiLeaks releases that Mr. El-Masri got some modicum of his dignity back at the European Court of Human Rights, because in the meanwhile, WikiLeaks releases also showed how the US put pressure on the German government not to acknowledge what had happened and not to take action against the 8 CIA operatives who had been involved in the renditions and the torture. So we know what really happened behind closed doors because of WikiLeaks. And just like George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, Julian and WikiLeaks allowed us to say Black lives really matter, not by taking the knee, but by recognizing the murders and torture, rape that took place in Iraq and Afghanistan when we destroyed those nations. But there will be many people in this audience who may not necessarily be interested in foreign policy, who may not necessarily be interested in, I mean, some of you may be interested in war, may be interested in those crimes. Some of you may be more motivated by environmental crimes and by corruption issues in that regard. And WikiLeaks revealed the Trafigura toxic waste dumping off the Ivory Coast, corruption in Arap Moi's government in Kenya, and a host of other things. And it did this through what we all now take for granted, whether it is through most of the mainstream news websites, which was not common then, which was a secure Dropbox, which we use in our everyday lives, but also WikiLeaks pioneered the secure drop, which allowed whistleblowers not to have to be like the brave Edward Snowden or the Chelsea Manning. They didn't have to reveal their identity. And yet WikiLeaks allowed, through its network of experts like John Sloboda or Andy Worthington on the Guantanamo Bay detainee assessment briefs and others, to allow for the security not just of the whistleblower but of the document, which is why WikiLeaks to this day has a 100% track record of accuracy. They allowed us to have a shared memory of our history, not through the abbreviated lenses of journalists with their own biases and their own pressures and their own time commitments, or publishers with their own commercial motives, but the unfiltered, unvarnished truth. Of course, Julian did redact and keep us back several thousand documents in order to ensure a certain quality. But in the main, he allowed us to have an archive that allowed a quality of research that allows us to this day to understand what is happening in the Ukraine war through the cable which tells us what commitments NATO had made in relation to expansion towards Russia. So WikiLeaks remains relevant to this day. But returning to Julian and the observations in court, nothing about the process that I have seen so far appears reasonable or in any way allied to justice. It is very rare that we have situations where the prosecuting state has been confirmed by 30 US government insiders to have plotted to kill the defendant in a sovereign embassy on British soil and to agree to engage in a shootout on the streets of Knightsbridge. It is very rare that the prosecuting state bribes an Icelandic national, a serial pedophile and fraudster, who has admitted that in exchange for immunity in his own crimes, he fabricated evidence against the defendant. It is very rare where the justice system, judges and lawyers, are undisturbed and continue as though there is this elephant not in the room, that the US spied on the privileged legal conversations between Julian and his lawyers. And not for a day, not for a few hours, but for months on end. And the prosecuting state is also ignoring international law, ignoring, and so is the host state, ignoring findings of torture, ignoring repeated findings of arbitrary detention. And yet, unlike in Daniel Ellsberg's case, where the break-in into the study of his psychiatrist threw the case out of court, in Julian's case, the justice system continues to turn a blind eye to the truth. And it is like the pretense we have at Guantanamo Bay of the military commissions, which provide a fig leaf for the nakedness of the emperor and the clear failures in both morality and law in allowing this kind of disgrace to continue. The disgrace of a bully state that is manipulating the law to give a pretense of a legal process to what is entirely illegal. And that is manufacturing consent for this process amongst both the legal community and the journalists who seem to be reporting the detail and interested in the detail, but are not looking at the big picture. Julian has been made to suffer both unfairness and indignity, whether it is the deprivation of the judge saying she can do nothing about the deprivation of his privileged legal papers on the first day of his hearing, whether it is the fact that this indictment, the second superseding indictment, is served halfway through the process, where already some part of the process has taken place, whether it is him being placed in a perspex box, having to talk over the heads of the FBI agents to get the attention of his lawyers, or him who is a person who, of course, a peaceful person, but also somebody who is severely depressed, having to go down on his knees despite his osteoporosis, to speak through a small gap in the perspex box in order to get the attention of his lawyers so he can say something to them. This is not a legal process, this is a sham. And I urge you, to stand up and say something, because it is amazing to me how many people know that this is wrong, but are in positions of comfort where they are unwilling to say anything, and who are willing to turn a blind eye to what is going on, who are willing to let this happen in a supposedly democratic state while we turn fingers at Putin or anybody else. What right do we have to do that if this is happening on our doorstep? And at this time, I also want to say that this torture is not just being done of Julian, and Nils Melzer always says all torture is psychological torture, and Julian has suffered both physical and psychological torture. As you know, he had a stroke, a mini stroke, during his hearing, while the prosecutor was forcing him to listen to to the prosecutor saying that Julian is malingering. And this is the horror that we are witnessing. But it is also the horror that Stella, the two children, and Julian's family here, and friends, and the loved ones are witnessing, to see this decade-long, or 15 years now, 14 years, destruction of somebody for telling the truth, for allowing us to see the crimes that our governments commit in our name. And to this day, last week we hear that Julian has been told that he cannot have his wedding in the prison's chapel where he regularly worships. He can only have it in the room next door. The indignities and the basic horrific cruelty of giving him a laptop after months of begging for access and keying the keys of that laptop down are disgusting. And we we are grateful that Stella is by his side, and wish them both a long and happy and peaceful married life with good health. And also, I would like to just end by saying that I also have great, I would say, love and respect for people I don't know, including people like Michael Ratner, the late Michael Ratner, and the late Gavin McFadden, who knew what was right and who stood by them. And let us be on the side of good with them rather than on the side of evil with the kinds of states that are engaging in this behavior. Thank you.
From London, we'll move not very far, but to Bergen. One of the most insisting and eloquent voices in Norway is Gisle Selnes. He's been writing for the last years, and he will see the Julian case not necessarily from Bergen, but from Norway and from his own working with the issue. Gisle.
Thank you. Dear congregation, I've been asked to say a few words about Assange and the Norwegian public debate, and to keep my sermon short and to the point. I will comply. I believe it's fair to say that as regards media coverage of the Assange case, Norway does not differ significantly from the broader European and American context. How should it? To a very large extent, Norwegian media rely on their mainstream liberal big brothers and sisters on the continent and overseas for their reporting on the twists and turns of the case, which is, with one exception in Norway, very limited, as well as for their op-eds or analysis in ironic square quotes. The one exception is, as every Norwegian in the audience probably knows, the leftist daily newspaper Klassekampen, which has a much wider circulation than its name, Class Struggle, would suggest. It is one of the few media outlets in Norway that actually, and well, on a global scale, that actually had their own reporters on site or via video link covering the court hearings in 2020. And it has been adamant in its support for Assange for years and years. At the other extreme, there is the liberal conservative Aftenposten, which should be well known even to our guests from abroad. In 2010, Aftenposten got hold of the entire Cablegate archive, that is, the 250,000 embassy cables leaked by Chelsea Manning to Assange and Wikileaks without Assange's approval. Not only did Aftenposten harvest a couple of international headlines and local scoop awards for its reporting based on this material, they also bought into the widespread smears about WikiLeaks' alleged reckless dumping of the unredacted cables. Of course, in stark contrast to Aftenposten's own alleged conscientious editing and reporting of the same. For almost 12 years, from September 2010 and virtually until yesterday, Aftenposten's journalists have disseminated their self-congratulatory Manichaean lies, which should be banned from any church, desacralized or not. Yet, sadly enough, these reporters are still held to be national experts and first-hand witnesses of WikiLeaks and the Assange case. The simple truth being that they have not made one single effort to fact-check their own apocryphal version of the Cablegate Gospel, or any other lie about WikiLeaks and Assange, for that matter. Speaking of Gospels, the good news is that, even so, the Norwegian public debate, or the public view of the Assange case in Norway, has turned, I believe, to Assange's favor. Especially after Assange was dragged out of the Ecuadorian embassy in April 2019, put in a single cell in Her Majesty's high-security prison, Belmarsh, surrounded by terrorists and murders, and indicted with whatever came across the secret US grand jury's criminal minds. It was impossible, even for Aftenposten and their ilk, not to support a journalist and editor held in remand for years on end on spurious espionage charges, and placed in a bulletproof glass box, surrounded by prison guards and microphones in the courtroom without the possibility to communicate properly or freely with his own lawyers. Like the monster, the secret powers and military industrial complex incorporated would have us believe that he was. I firmly believe that they miscalculated the case on this single point. They gave the game away and lost their support, even among the most loyal messengers in the Fourth Estate. To quote a famous saying by a US president who in every respect outshines Biden, Trump, Obama, and the entire bush of unholy ghosts, you can fool all the people some of the time, and some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. Yes, the truth about the case of Julian Assange became too powerful to be kept covered up by the myths of the high and mighty. The mock trial, the blatant inequality of arms, the torture and punishment by process, the uncontestable revelations of the unlawful surveillance at the embassy, and the plot to kidnap or even assassinate Assange. This totally inhuman and in some sense ridiculous overkill of a non-violent publicist and truth seeker was the end of the era of virtually unchallenged lies. Even Assange's detractors in Aftenposten have changed, at least the public official mind. In two editorials, they have expressed their unconditional support for Assange's case and even advocated his immediate release. The same goes for a host of their colleagues in the mainstream Norwegian press. Stavanger Aftenblad, Adresseavisa, Fædrelandsvennen, Bergenstidene, only to mention a few. The last of these, BT, Bergen's leading newspaper, with a track record of Assange bashing that remains unsurpassed in a Norwegian context, have even urged the Norwegian government to put some pressure on our British and US allies while waiting for Assange to be discharged by the British judiciary. And this is what we are now trying to accomplish by all possible means through fundraising, op-eds and public events like the ones in Oslo today and in Bergen tomorrow. Since we are, after all, gathered in a church, let me end with a couple of verses from the Gospel, mediated by the man in support of whom we are congregated. These are Julian Assange's concluding words from a radio address broadcasted by BBC in 2014. The powerful would do well to remember the words of one of history's great activists as recorded in the book of Matthew. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed or hidden that will not be made known. What you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, and what you have whispered in the air, in the inner rooms, will be proclaimed at last from rooftop to rooftop. God bless you all, and free Julian Assange.
We shall cross the ocean up to Iceland, to a former minister. Can I call you a CIA basher? Yeah, they do exist. Ögmundur Jónasson.
Yes, my name is Ögmundur Jónasson, and I was born in Iceland in late summer 1948, almost to a day after the nuclear bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The first bomb was called Little Boy, then came Fat Man, killing at least 300,000 innocent people. I was 11 years old when Castro came to power in Cuba, ousting the dictator Batista, a friend of the United States. And I was 13 when the Americans attacked Cuba, destroying many of Cuba's aircraft, preparing for the for the Bay of Pigs invasion. This was in 1962, the year after the invasion, that the Soviets were going to transport nuclear weapons to Cuba, 150 kilometers from Florida. The Americans would not have that. But what they had done was to put up 100 nuclear warheads in Turkey, just south of the Soviet border, and nuclear warheads in Italy. This was the Cuban crisis. And the world was afraid. I remember, as a 13-year-old, how afraid I was. And the world was afraid because there were only 17 years since the murders in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And of course, there was no little boy. There was no fat man. There were people dressed like me in Pentagon and in Washington who ordered the murders. Then we had negotiations. The Soviets withdrew their nuclear weapons, and it is believed that the warheads were taken down in Turkey, at least temporarily. They are there now. We know that. And the same applied to Italy, as far as we know. Then followed many years of invasions and wars. We had the invasion of the Dominican Republic in 1965, Grenada, 1983, Panama, 1989. We had Chile, we had Guatemala. And in the other back garden, we had Hungary, the uprising in Hungary, of course. In 1956, the invasion of Czechoslovakia. In 1968, Tibet. 1959. And then, of course, Palestine. There were many more. And of course, Vietnam played a big role, in my youth at least. But there were other things happening as well, positive things. There was a peace movement, pressing NATO to withdraw medium-range nuclear heads in Europe. Millions of people in the street. And this had an effect. We had the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1970, where a decision was made to try to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. Of course, the big powers were not going to make slip of theirs, but there was this pressure from the world, from the public. I remember once, I think it was in 1973, I was 25 years old. I was on the night train from London to Edinburgh. And with me in the cabin, we were supposed to sleep, we didn't sleep, was a veteran from Vietnam. A soldier who had been fighting in Vietnam. He talked all night, I listened. And he said, "Do you know why they stopped giving news on how many people were killed this day and that day?" I remember that this was always on the news, but then they suddenly stopped. It was stopped when they realized that when we went out in the morning with our weapons, we hid and came back and lied because we didn't want to take part in this. And do you remember the little girl burning from napalm? We saw many such things, but not only we saw them. Our mothers saw them, our fathers saw them, our brothers saw them, our sisters saw them. And this is what stopped the Vietnam War. The world stopped the Vietnam War. The world stopped the building up of further nuclear arms. Not everything was solved or good. I have an experience from that myself. As a journalist for Icelandic television, I went to the mountains of Afghanistan in the early 1980s, interviewing the freedom fighters, later called the Taliban. At that time, they were the freedom fighters. And it was much later that I learned how much I had lied. This was after Brzezinski, Carter's main foreign advisor, revealed in an interview with a French newspaper how they had lured the Americans with lies into the Russians, into Soviets, into Afghanistan in order to give them their Vietnam. But the important thing is this, that the world was waking up. There were these treaties, there were limitations on nuclear arms, the INF Treaty in 1987, a direct consequence of the peace movement. Then the Twin Towers in America exploded, or were exploded, and things changed. Not because of that, not because of the explosions, because there were new people who had arrived on the scene. Dick Cheney, Rumsfeld, Bush, Condoleezza Rice from the oil industry. And what Bush said, and was of immense importance, was that now there was time to declare war, a global war on terrorism. What does that mean? Cicero, in the 1st century before Christ, he knew what it meant. He said, "Silent enim leges inter arma." In times of war, the law becomes silent. And this is what changed at the turn of the century. And therefore they could go into Afghanistan. They went into Iraq. They could erect Guantanamo Bay for torturing people. And people couldn't speak because we were at war. And they had domestic security and new laws enacted, not only in the United States, throughout the world. And it is into this picture Wikileaks steps on our behalf to open up the world again, to tell us what happened in Afghanistan, to tell us what happened in Iraq, to tell us what was happening and is still happening in Guantanamo. And later, they told us what was happening in the international trade negotiations, where they are giving away democratic rights to international capitalist companies. This was Wikileaks who did it all. And you mentioned the Ivory Coast. And I know from first hand how they operate, because they visited Iceland. That they did in 2011. And nota bene, this is just after the revelation of the Afghan-Iraqi war crimes that they were revealed. And they knocked on our doors. They did this in June 2011 and said that they had knowledge of an imminent cyber attack on all main institutions in Iceland, the energy sector and the government offices, if we did want to know about this and have cooperation. Yes, we did want to know about this and have cooperation. But nothing came out of that. Later in the summer, on the 24th of August 2011, a plane load of FBI agents arrived in Reykjavik. They made their way to the prosecutor's office and had scheduled meetings at lunchtime with the police authorities. But there was one problem: the minister. I was a minister, and I wanted to know their errand. And they said, we are continuing our cooperation from earlier in the summer. I got further information on the errand. And then it was said that they were in Iceland to seek cooperation in framing Julian Assange, to arrange an interview with a person who would serve as an entrapment for framing Julian Assange. And I informed all authorities in Iceland to cease all cooperation, and they had to leave the country. And then a year passes. In early 2013, another knock on the door by this man, the editor-in-chief of Wikileaks. And he asks if it is correct what he has heard, that the FBI had come to Iceland in order to do what I've just described. Yes, I said that's right. Will I acknowledge this if this is brought up in the news? Yes, I will. And that's what we then did. But when FBI went elsewhere, the authorities in those countries where they came said no comment. But this is what we are gathered about, to say we have no patience for no comment. Now we want action, and we want Julian Assange freed now.
Norway has a president candidate in France. We brought her here. Eva Joly.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here, so many, to listen to people who want to free Assange. I must say, Iceland is a small country, only 330,000 inhabitants, but they have had some very important politicians. I think we should give tribute to the Minister of Interior in 2011. This Minister of Interior in 2011 also recruited me with his fellow ministers to come to Iceland and to look into the banks and to see whether there had been some economic crimes that explained how this country could wake up with 13 billion in debt suddenly. And I was happy to work with the prosecutor there. And at that time, when I started working, Julian Assange came to Iceland because he had a project. He knew that, for instance, Glencore, the multinational that did poison the Ivory Coast in England, it was forbidden to talk about it because the English legal system has what they call injunctions. People can be ordered. Journalists can get the order. It is forbidden to talk about this subject, and you cannot even tell that you have got this injunction. So Assange had the idea that maybe somewhere in the world we could have a paradise for journalists with freedom, and where they didn't have injunctions or libel suits. And he worked with some parliamentarians in their parliament, and I met with them because this project, I thought it was wonderful. And then I went back to France, where I did run for presidency in 2012. So I lost Assange a little bit out of sight. But I also started working in Kabul, in Afghanistan. And when I discovered that the man I admired before the Collateral Murder was published, he was imprisoned, or he had went into an embassy to seek asylum. I wanted to see him again, and I started visiting him there. And then I learned about the Swedish case. And I think that was the first time I met with him in 2012. And he told me what had happened, that he was falsely accused of sexual assault by two women, and he told me really what happened, and I noticed that there were so many things that was not normal, and especially that the investigator in head of this inquiry, it was a woman. She's called Marianne Ny. She had written and told people that she could not go to London to interrogate Assange, and she put forward an European arrest order. And I, as an old investigator, I knew that this was totally wrong, that it is a very normal thing to have cooperation and to go to another country and you respect some formalities, but it is an easy thing to do. So I thought, she don't know, or she's manipulated, and I want to tell her. I thought maybe I can do that because this is Sweden, and I was still confident that people would be reasonable and that I could convince them. I think that is my very optimistic side. So I just decided to go there. I did write her, and I did write to the Minister of Justice, suggesting that maybe they should change the prosecutor because she looked like she was in a trap. And I didn't get any answer, but I went to Stockholm, and I had a lot of meetings with people, and I made also some meetings with journalists on the television to tell that this was wrong, and that they should put an end to this inquiry by interrogating him in the embassy, because that was the only way to respect his right to asylum, not oblige him to come to Sweden. At that time, Assange told me that he knew that there was an ongoing inquiry in the US, a secret inquiry, but that was not public yet, or not known. And today we know, because journalists have had access to the files, we know that the US had asked member countries of the NATO to start criminal investigations against Assange. And I think that they had the kind of opportunity in Sweden that they used. And journalists has also found emails between Marianne Ny and the British prosecutor, who is now the opposition leader, where Marianne Ny wanted to retire or to stop the investigation. And she got a mail where the British prosecutors say, "Don't get cold feet now." So there is no doubt today that this was manipulated. And we know how damageable this has been to Assange's image. They have really destroyed this, because it also met with the movement, the gender movement. So I think this was terrible. About the asylum in an embassy, in France we know that very well, because when Allende was turned down by Pinochet, the French embassy was full of Chilean people. I think there were several hundred, and that was the start of this form of asylum. So Sweden didn't want to respect this because they had another aim. It was to get Assange to Sweden. And in order to protect himself, he went into the embassy, and then he was not able to go to the police station to have a stamp every week on bail, because they had the British authorities had given him bail. He was free while waiting for the extradition to Sweden. And then years go on. He's thrown out of the embassy, as you know, in April 19. And at that moment, there was no investigation anymore. And the only thing they had to keep him in prison was the violation of bail, which is a minuscule offense, and especially when the reason for that bail don't exist anymore. So I was confident, because I'm optimistic, that he will be set free. But guess what? In the magistrate court, you had a judge who sentenced him to the severest sentence foreseen by law for this offense, 50 weeks. That was the start. And they put him in a high-security prison in Belmarsh. And after the sentence was finished, he was not set free. And you see, these are also abnormal decisions. An independent judiciary would never have given 50 weeks imprisonment for such a minor offense. And this is what is really worrisome for our democracy. It is the way the Swedish judiciary was used, and it is the way the British judiciary is used today. Because what Deepa told us, it is not normal justice. It is not normal justice. It is not normal behavior by judges not to allow the charged person to sit with his lawyers. Not normal. Nothing is normal. And he is treated worse than a terrorist having killed hundreds of people. And this is why we are the only one, the people that can stop this. We must tell UK that we are watching them, and we will not believe that if the decision of extradition is not overturned in the Supreme Court, we will lose all confidence in their system. And we must tell them no, so that they know that we are watching, that we have understood, and that we will not accept it. So, free Assange today.
Kringsatt av fiender. Gå inn i din tid. Under en blodig storm. Vi deg til strid. Kanskje du spør i angst. Udekket, åpen. Hva skal jeg kjempe med? Hva mitt våpen? Her ditt vern mot vold. Her ditt sverd. Troen på livet vårt. Menneskets verd. For all vår fremtids skyld. Søk det. Dyrk det. Dø om du må. Men øk det. Og styrk det. Stilt glid granatenes glidende bånd. Stans deres drift mot død. Stans dem med ånd. Krig er forakt for liv. Fred er å skape. Kast dine krefter inn. Døden skal tape. Elsk og berik med drøm alt stort som var. Gå mot det ukjente. Frariste svar. Ubygde kraftverker. Ukjente stjerner. Skap dem og skån dem med skånet livs dristige hjerner. Edelt er mennesket. Jorden er rik. Finnes det nød og sult? Skyldes det svik? Knus det. I livets navn skal urett falle. Solskinn og brød og ånd eies av alle. Da synker våpnene maktesløst ned. Skaper vi menneskeverd? Skaper vi fred? Den som på høyre arm bærer en byrde dyr og umistelig, kan ikke myrde. Dette er løftet vårt. Fra bror til bror. Vi skal bli gode mot menneskenes jord. Vi skal ta vare på skjønnheten, varmen, som om vi bar et barn varsomt på armen.
You have to bear with us. We are running over time, but we have a little more. We're going to change speed. A few weeks ago, a few days ago actually, Stella Morris, the wife-to-be, went to Austria to receive a prize, the Renner Prize, prestigious journalistic Renner Prize on behalf of Julian. And she made a speech, a very short one, and we're going to watch that now.
I want to say a few words about what we think is unthinkable. In 2010, many people said it was unthinkable that the US would prosecute Julian or try to extradite him or tried to put him in prison for the rest of his life. In 2010, they said it was unthinkable that the US would seriously engage in plans, concrete plans to assassinate Julian. In 2010, many would say it was unthinkable that the UK and the US would collude to inflict psychological torture on a journalist and subject him to arbitrary detention for over a decade or the rest of his life because of what he published. And yet, here we are. We know that the Obama administration from the beginning was seriously considering charging Julian, but refrained because the Obama administration recognized that to do so would criminalize investigative journalism, would attack the press, would do away with press freedom. The recognition was that to prosecute Julian, the US would have to prosecute him as a publisher, as a journalist. The Obama administration commuted Chelsea Manning's sentence, who was the source of the publications. And then the Trump administration decided that actually journalists and publishers are fair game. And so he proceeded to prosecute Julian, not as a whistleblower, as a journalist, and setting that precedent. Not as a US journalist, as a foreign journalist, publishing from abroad, setting a new global standard. Think about what that means. The US is extending its so-called Espionage Act beyond its borders to limit press freedom abroad. It's creating a new normal, a race to the bottom, an opportunity for authoritarians everywhere to use the same logic against their journalists and foreign journalists who dare expose their war crimes. There is no safe place for journalists as long as Julian is in prison. In 2010, many said that the possibility of Julian being assassinated by the United States was some kind of paranoid fantasy, but not for Mike Pompeo. For Mike Pompeo, this was a high priority. The assassination of Julian was discussed at the highest levels of the Trump administration. And not just Julian. Other unnamed WikiLeaks associates in Europe, in European countries, were also being considered for assassination, according to an investigative report published in September. That report had over 30 sources from the National Security Council of the United States, both named and unnamed, from the CIA and from the White House, the Trump White House. And when it was published, Mike Pompeo confirmed the story by calling for the sources to be prosecuted. There is nothing that is unthinkable anymore. There is no freedom of press, and there is no freedom of conscience as long as Julian is imprisoned. The unthinkable is here. The unthinkable is now. Free Julian, and may peace return to Europe and to every country suffering the scourge of war. Thank you.
We cannot leave before some new words from Iceland, from WikiLeaks. Where are we now? Kristinn Hrafnsson, the Raven.
I want to thank the organizers for organizing this very important event, and for all of you to come here and show your support. This will shine a ray of light into a dungeon in the southeast part of London, where Julian will have resided for 3 years as an innocent man on April 11th next month. We are here tonight in the shadow of war. The guns are speaking, the bombs are falling, people are fleeing in the millions, and innocent children are hiding and being scarred for life by the trauma of war. We know the horror of war very well. And part of the reason why we know the horror of war against civilians is because of Wikileaks. Because of what Wikileaks has revealed about the horror of previous wars. And because of that, I believe we are disgusted by current event. That's why we protest, that's why we want peace. It has been discussed here tonight, the revelations from 2010 and 2011 that are the basis and the foundation for the so-called indictment against Julian Assange, the exposure from the Afghan war, Iraq war, Guantanamo Bay, and the diplomatic cables of 2010-2011. Those revelations, the truths about the war, are the basis for the indictment against Julian, where they are demanding 175 years in prison for exposing the truth, to you, the general public that we serve as journalists, as all journalists should do. I have often met, surprised with people who tell me that they simply cannot understand why this strong reaction is to this revelation. There is something very wrong here. How can it come about that they are relentlessly going after Julian for these revelations? Revelations that were actually prepared and published in coordination with one of the biggest powerhouses in Western media, The Guardian, The New York Times, El País, Le Monde, Al Jazeera, Swedish television, Aftenposten, etc. Why on earth this strong reaction? There's a reason to that, possibly, that we need to start to ponder. And especially now, when every day in the media we are being reminded by opinion makers and those who are speaking to us about the importance of sticking together, the importance of unity, because we have to preserve our sacred values, democracy, human rights, freedom. Every day we hear that again and again. That's why we have to stick together in the current crisis. But how holy are those elements and those values to us in reality? That is the question we should start to think about and ponder in the day and age that we live. There are actually two sides to the Wikileaks story. One side are the actual stories and the material that has been published by Wikileaks. Not just on the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and Guantanamo Bay, but also toxic waste dumping, environmental stories, corruption in the banking sector, Bank of Julius Baer, bank in my home country, in Iceland, etc. Corruption in the process in international treaties, as Ögmundur mentioned, the TISA, the TPP, are totally undemocratic processes that were exposed and stopped because it was revealed what was going on. Now, the reaction to these revelations are a totally different story and maybe a much bigger story. The persecution of Julian Assange is in its essence becoming a bigger story than actually the revelations that he is now hunted for. It is what it entails, the horrible methods that are being used and the values that are thrown out the window in the process. It reveals something something terrible about what's going on. How can it come about, as Deepa was describing, that the US is able to twist and turn an entire justice system in the oldest democracy in the world, or the next one after Iceland, of course, to throw out all the values in the UK justice out the window, and the examples are endless in that judicial process. It is such a sham that you don't need a law degree to see it. I mean, a child can just see the process and read through the documents there and see, my God, what is going on? A total violation of everything. And the US, of course, easily able to twist Sweden into compliance and throwing all their ideals, the lofty ideals known around the world, the human rights record, known as probably as well as IKEA, that all gone, all out the window. So why on earth this reaction? Why on earth can it happen that Mike Pompeo, as CIA director in 2017, will go in his first public event to the podium to talk about the dangers that CIA has to fight and his role in that fight in the Trump administration? He mentioned two elements as the biggest danger to the United States national security: Al-Qaeda and Wikileaks. Al-Qaeda and Wikileaks. Al-Qaeda and the truth. How afraid of truth can you be? What is the truth rocking? Are we maybe getting closer to the real story here? What did Wikileaks do? What did Julian Assange do that merits this reaction? Had we possibly, in the post-9/11 years, been getting accustomed to slowly blackening out of all the windows, so slowly that we didn't notice it, until Julian Assange comes along and scratches one of the window, and the sun rays flood the room through its scratch, exposing what is really going on. That is the crime. And that is what we need to think about. The big picture. That is the big picture. But of course, people only need a little scratch. You don't need to throw down all the Potemkin curtains. A ray of light with the truth is enough to show you that you're living possibly in a rather terrible facade of a democracy, possibly where our beliefs and lofty ideals of human rights are not that sacred by our political leaders as they will proclaim. And possibly freedom is not that important when you have a business to run. So this is the reality that people are waking up to. And this is the reality that you are understanding. More and more people are coming on board. More and more politicians across the aisle from all political parties all over the world and country after country are understanding that this cannot go on because it goes counter to the ideals that we believe are sacred. And it's because of that that it's so important to end this persecution against Julian Assange, to end this persecution for his sake, but for all our sakes. We have to do something. I thank you for coming here, but I urge you also to be the part of the vanguard who fights for those causes, to speak out, to talk to people, let them know we are millions. Talk to the politicians, encourage them, demand that the Norwegian government speaks out formally in unity and condemns this and demands that the persecution of Julian Assange end. Talk to anybody that you know in the journalistic community at Aftenposten, at VG, at the other newspapers, and tell the journalist, this is about you, mate. You're next. That should be pretty obvious. It is about all those things that is so important, not just about one life, but all our entire days in this time and age. Just a final thought here about the fact that I'm here in Norway, which is, of course, next door neighbor to us Icelanders. We are not going to do any land claims to west of Norway, even though some of my ancestors, 35 generations back, lost their land as political refugees going to Iceland. Don't worry, it's not going to happen. But I was recently reading a story about this time and age, and I was reflecting back on the fact that why I feel this closeness, despite thousands years apart, despite the languages becoming so different that I have to speak English here tonight. It is because there is a common thread and a set of values that despite the layers of cultural additions throughout all this long time, there is still among us here, in my home country in Iceland, and here in this country, a sense of honor that needs to be upheld. It's the old sacred code from pre-Christianity, from heathen days. Honor was important. And imagine one example of this is, of course, Leif Eriksson, who was the first European to set foot on North American soil. He maybe should have stayed a little longer. Leif Eriksson, son of Iceland, grandson of Norway, grandson of Erik the Red. We know him in Iceland, and he's revered. We know him as Leifur Heppni, Leifur the Fortunate. Why did we call him Fortunate? He didn't earn that nickname that has survived over 1,100 years for discovering a new continent in the West. He earned that nickname because he was fortunate enough to get into a position to save human lives. Stranded colleagues in the Viking community that were shipwrecked on a small island. And that was his luck to save lives. And on this note, I hope that we will all one day gather together and earn a part of a similar nickname, to have the fortunate luck of freeing Julian Assange, to be on the right side of history, and to save his life, and so much more in the process. Thank you very much.
With some music, we shall end with some music, and after that, the Culture Church Jacob has said that the bar is open, and we can mingle and talk to these wonderful people. What do you give this man? This one. This is what you're doing, eh? Yeah. Traveling around with a big, traveling around with a big screen. Yeah. So we want you to take this one instead of flowers. We wanted to say a few words before we end up with music and some more talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Gosh, last in the queue. I can only think of Newton's statement, you know, if I see any distance at all, it's because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants tonight here. As they mentioned poetry today, I just would say that Prometheus Unbound has as its theme the only way or the only road to freedom is knowledge. And just two pearls. In the Wikileaks cables, among innumerable revelations, is a cable which, from the ambassador in Moscow, informing the Bush administration, the Bush W Junior administration, that Moscow will not allow NATO to move into Ukraine. Will not allow NATO to move into Ukraine. That knowledge could have prevented a war but ignored. Another more simple one is that Rafael Correa moved into government, and his government was very frightened of the elite police force. However, the cables revealed that the wages of the elite police force were paid by the American embassy. So Rafael just increased all of the other policemen's wages to that of the elite police force, and his government was consequently secure. I'd like to just now take a different insight for you into Kristinn and Julian. I'll just do this as a way, it might work. Let's see.
We also have one individual appears to be wounded, trying to crawl away. Roger, we're going to move down there. Roger, we'll cease fire. And we won't shoot anymore.
Well, you recognize that, don't you? Collateral murder. 2 war crimes there, unpursued. Julian and Kristinn thought to give names to the dead and also to inform the relatives of the 2 journalists murdered of what had happened. This required Kristinn to go to Seda City. At that time was murder central. Kristinn went to Seda City, and that is that video of Kristinn showing the nephews of the murdered journalists. That video is available on Wikileaks site. Such extraordinary courage and deep understanding of the necessity to give names to the dead in order to commemorate the dead. It must be something in the water in Iceland, because we have 2 Icelanders here tonight sitting alongside each other, which have demonstrated a sensitivity to human difficulties and outstanding courage. So I wish to leave it on that note, except if we could, two more things. One is Julian and Stella marry on the 23rd, and I hope you wish them a long and happy marriage together. And the very last, if the Norwegians wish to help, and I see that they do, you should wield your strongest, mightiest weapon. But don't leave it too long, for the Nobel Prize is not given posthumously. Thank you.